Hi, my name is Jonathan Dong, and this is our group presentation. We'll be focusing on Law and Order episodes with Latin American representation. For those who don't know, Law and Order is a dramatized TV show that occasionally take real news headlines and use that either for their episode titles or their episode premises. They do fictional homicide cases, showcasing both the detective and prosecutor side. The show takes place in New York City. They find suspects, talk to witnesses, and convict individuals, or at least attempt to convict them. There's currently 24 seasons consisting of 518 episodes. The first episode we'll focus on is season 11, episode 11, Sunday in the Park with Jorge. I want to draw your attention to the image there where it says, although inspired in part by a true incident, the following story is fictional and does not depict any actual person or event. So the usual Law and Order episode does not have this warning screen. It when you're consuming media, you already assume what you're about to see is fictional, but now implying that there is some truth behind this episode, it is already making the viewer think, what am I about to see? What part of it is true and what part of it is not? So now I want to go into my first clip.
In the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups: the police who investigate crime and the district attorneys who prosecute the offenders. These are their stories.
So for context for that clip, it is based on a real event during the National Puerto Rican Day Parade that occurred on June 11th, 2000 in New York's Central Park. The event had already received widespread criticism at the time for how the police handled the situation, as well as some backlash towards the Puerto Rican community since it had occurred on the National Puerto Rican Day Parade. Several dozen women were sexually assaulted by groups of men with varying ethnicities. One woman recounted a police officer's statement stating, what you're describing as sexual assault, I think you need to calm down and come back tomorrow. The lack of police involvement was a major criticism for this event, as not many had assisted during the attacks. For the clip, they decided to show a select demographic in this light. Since it did occur on the Puerto Rican Day Parade, you can see many people waving around Puerto Rican flags, which can mislead the viewer to think that it is just Puerto Ricans acting in this manner. And the earlier screen can make you believe that all Puerto Ricans act like this, that they're uncivilized and that they're wild. Um, this episode did eventually get taken out of the airing schedule, so it doesn't air anymore on live TV, but you can still find it on streaming services. I believe the representation was very singular towards the Puerto Ricans, and that's not saying that this event should be overlooked for the tragedy that it is, but I believe that there should have been more representation of the police handling at fault and or a varying ethnicity showing of the assailants instead of being majorly focused on the Puerto Rican demographic.
Clips 2. Context of the term wilding. Before watching the clips, the term wilding became widely known during the Central Park jogger case that happened in 1989. In this case, five boys of color were falsely accused of raping and beating a 28-year-old white woman. The police and media labeled them as wilding, suggesting they were violent and out of control. In the article, The Word on Wilding, Jeffrey A. Crossler writes that Sarah Burns asserts that the term did not actually exist among urban youth, but was a creation of the police and the media. Crossler also points out that the term came to define the inhumanity of these kids. Unfortunately, the boys were pressured into falsely confessing even though they were innocent due to harsh and misleading police interrogation tactics. Their convictions were overturned years later after DNA evidence and the confession of the real attacker proved their innocence. Context of the Puerto Rican parade. This episode of Law and Order, Sunday in the Park with Jorge, was inspired by real life events that occurred during the Puerto Rican parade in the early 2000s. This real life event was compared to what happened to the Central Park jogger before people knew who the real attacker was. What had happened in the real life event was that, according to Hoffney from the Washington Post, following a weekend of unusual violence here, police are investigating a frightening series of assaults in which a group of men robbed, stripped, or sexually abused 6 women in well-traveled parts of Central Park, one of the city's most popular tourist attractions. Overall, the Washington Post reports that at least 6 women were assaulted and that the suspects targeted people of various races and nationalities, including tourists from France and England. 2 men were arrested and others were sought by the police, but there was no official statement that the attackers were representative of the Puerto Rican community or that the attacks were racially motivated. Nevertheless, the attacks were heavily publicized and associated with the parade. And right now I'll be showing the 2 clips.
There was considerable public outcry that the cops didn't do more by way of responding to the wilding in the park. There'd been some hope that an effective prosecution in this case would offset that.
We're anticipating that there will be an effective prosecution.
But it's not a prosecution of one of the individuals involved in the wilding.
That's because we don't have the necessary evidence to prosecute any of those individuals.
Sounds like the only evidence you got against that Titel is circumstantial.
That's usually the case with homicide.
Okay, look, I'm all for a level playing field, justice being colorblind, etc. We had hoped to use this trial to punish one or more of these Puerto Ricans who went nuts in the park that day. If we can't, we...
I ask you to make this guy feel taken care of, and you make him a suspect?
We're going where this investigation takes us, Chief.
Which is exactly what you're supposed to be doing, Lieutenant. Downtown just finds it a bit hard to fathom why your guys are so focused on the victim's husband. When there's no history of domestic abuse, no criminal record, no nothing.
Hey, there was a nasty divorce about to happen.
And that makes it likely in your mind for a guy like this to do a murder.
It makes it worth looking into, yes.
Chief, we still have a lot of work to do.
Do us all a favor. Find out it was one of the punks from the parade.
Context of the Puerto Rican parade. As we can see in the 2 clips, the connection to the Law and Order episode lies in how the show takes a real-life incident and dramatizes it in a way that stereotypes Puerto Ricans and Latinos as violent, aggressive, and dangerous. The term wilding, famously used in the Central Park jogger case, is mentioned in this episode to describe the attackers during the parade. Even though this term is being used in a racial and dehumanized way, it is still mentioned in the show, which reinforces the idea that Latino groups, especially young men, are out of control and violent. In another scene, the police chief gets angry when detectives suspect the white husband of the victim might have committed the crime. This demonstrates how quickly and aggressively Latinos are targeted while white people are protected from suspicion. Analysis. What does it tell us about Latin American history and culture? It shows how Latin American and Caribbean communities, especially Puerto Ricans, have often been misrepresented in the U.S. media. Rather than celebrating the culture and identity of Puerto Ricans, the episode Sunday in the Park with Jorge distorts a real event to fit a narrative that stereotypes Puerto Ricans and Latinos. The episode reinforces harmful ideas that Latino culture is connected to violence despite a lack of evidence. Analysis. Does this accurately depict the historical moment, event, individuals? The episode does not accurately depict the real-life events or individuals involved. There is no evidence that the attackers represented the Puerto Rican community, yet the show connects the violence to the parade. If not, why does this matter? Misrepresenting the facts spreads false narratives about an entire community. These portrayals influence public perception, making it easier to justify racial profiling, discrimination, and unequal treatment in real life.
The next one that we're going to be talking about is Season 20, Episode 7, Boy Gone Astray, which follows the murder of a woman in New York City by 2 boys who were taken from their homes in New York to train with a cartel in Mexico, where they were trained to be assassins and killers, who then assassinated her because she was a drug dealer for a rival cartel. This is a screenshot from the clip that I'm going to share. She's one of the prosecutors who is describing the cartel heads as folk heroes. So the context is that in 2008, stories began to break about Mexican cartels recruiting and training U.S. teens as killers. The first one that I found is in April of 2008, where the Dallas Morning News reported paramilitary training camps and teens, quote, carrying out killings and other cartel assignments on both sides of the border. The article describes the targeted demographic of these recruitments as, quote, ranging from Mexican army deserters to American teenagers. Then in June of 2009, the New York Times wrote that cartels promise teens high pay, fancy cars, and sexy women. Then in March of 2009, CNN publishes the headline, U.S. teens were hitmen for Mexican cartel. This image on the left is one of the images that they included in that article. I think this is the individual that they interviewed, and he's quoted as saying that they tried to take the gun away, but it was like taking candy from a kid. So the article describes that as teens became more immersed in their cartel lifestyle, their appearance changed, and it details their tattoos. This is the guy that they interviewed showing off his tattoos. There's another one on the next slide, but the article also mentions, quote, Santa Muerte, the Grim Reaper-like pseudo-saint worshipped by drug traffickers. So these articles were necessary to inform the public, but it also incited fear among them. Like in that last one, pseudo-saints worshipped by the cartels. It just sort of adds this almost cultish fear to the cartels and really mysticizes them in a way that isn't 100% necessary to inform the public. So here's another example of a photograph in the article from CNN, which the quotes and articles propagate the idea that affiliations with the cartel automatically makes like the idealized, good, respectable American into a criminalized, hardened killing machine, which is just kind of the stereotype of, sort of pipeline from low-income community or family to cartel ties to life of crime. And so stories like these were then adopted by entertainment media such as Law and Order's season 20, episode 7, Boy Gone Astray. And we're going to show a clip of it now.
The police found it on Wilshire's iPod and on a laptop in the Scarsdale house. It's about a Mexican drug family.
The song says the family is so bad that they have hot Yankee blondes selling their dope for them.
It's a tribute.
It's a narco corrido, a drug ballad. They're very popular in Mexico and in the Latin communities in the U.S. These guys are folk heroes.
Not to mention pushers and murderers.
Well, you'd have to know Mexico's colonial history. Banditos fought the power. Banditos like my ancestor, Juan Cortina. People revered them.
Your ancestor. Maybe I should keep a closer eye on you. So the Vela cartel targeted Nina Wilshire because she was in a song that extolled the virtues of a rival cartel.
Yeah, well, it's called talking smack with a semi-automatic.
So my analysis of this clip and much of the episode in general is that it spends a lot of time casually demonizing not only Mexican cartels, but just the Latin American community in the United States overall, which is likely the result of coverage like the ones mentioned in sources such as CNN. So in a way, the episode does do a good job of reflecting the public perception of Mexican cartels in that there's a lot of fear and a lot of stigma in the episode, which reflects that just existed and still exists in real life. But it also raises the question of whether or not an accurate depiction of anxieties surrounding Latin America's connections to the drug trade perpetuates the stereotypes or simply represents them. It could be both, and I think in this case it is. One example is that the lieutenant, when referring to the teenage killers in the episode, says that whoever's in that house is a lot scarier than we are, because the boys' parents were initially really hesitant to work with the police department and the district attorneys to get a conviction because they were more afraid of what the cartel would do to themselves, the rest of their family, and their son who was tied up with them than they were about anything the law could do, which goes a long way in showing the level of fear that this specific piece of media shows the community has. And like I said, it is an accurate depiction, but at the same time, it could be contributing to those same fears.
Like Anthony mentioned, Law and Order: Boy Gone Astray delves into the complex world of cartel-related violence and how teens are recruited into these dangerous organizations. The episode shows how cartels often lure young people by promising wealth, power, and status, methods that make it difficult for teens to resist. However, while the episode addresses the criminal tactics of the cartels, it doesn't fully explore one of the most important consequences, which is the devastating impact cartel involvement has on families. In this episode, we see how the lives of teenagers are transformed when they are drawn into cartel violence, but their families are the ones left to deal with the aftermath. Today, my focus will be on the effect of cartel violence on families, specifically how these young recruits' involvements in cartels not only changes their own lives, but tears apart the fabric of their families. I'll explore how families cope with the emotional, social, and even legal ramifications of their children's involvement in such violent organizations. Through my analysis of this episode, I'll discuss how media portrayals like this one can help shape our understanding of the real-life impacts of such situations. At the time this episode was aired, there were several media outlets and reports that addressed the growing concerns about the impact of drug cartels on families. In 2009, outlets such as the CNN, the New York Times, and the Dallas Morning News started to report more extensively on the growing trend of U.S. teenagers being recruited by Mexican cartels. These articles and stories frequently mention the devastating effect on families, detailing the psychological trauma parents experience as they saw their children fall under the influence of cartels. The coverage highlighted family dynamics with parents feeling powerless, guilty, and afraid for their children's lives, especially in cases where teens became involved in violent activities.
She has a lion's heart. Isabel, we should just listen. See how they can help us with Rafa.
No. I will not ask him to speak against those people. We have other children to worry about.
I'm sorry. I'm gonna cooperate. He murders a woman that he sings about.
In this clip, we witnessed the emotional weight placed on the families of the teens involved with the cartel. The clip highlights the anger, guilt, and helplessness felt by the parents as they struggle to understand what has happened to their son and how he has ended up in this violent world. The mother's perspective is particularly emotional. She expresses her concern not only for her son involved, but with the cartel and her other children. They are now living under the constant threat of violence and exposure to the cartel's influence. This also resonates with the real-life consequences families face when one member gets involved with cartels, leading to emotional instability and fear for the safety of the entire family. The mother's certainty that her son is a lost cause further illustrates the deep sense of helplessness families often feel. She knows that the cartel's grip on her child has led to a point of no return, and this mirrors real-world situations where families are forced to watch their loved ones spiral into criminal activity with little chance of pulling them out. Additionally, the mother's fear for the family's safety should her son speak out against the cartels highlights a critical issue. Families become targets when they try to distance themselves from cartel activity or cooperate with law enforcement. Finally, the father's apology to the lawyers undergoes the guilt and shame many families feel when a member becomes involved with cartel violence. Parents often internalize the blame, feeling that they failed to protect their children from the allure or coercion of cartel life. The emotional burden, which can lead to psychological trauma and family rifts, is something that is rarely addressed in media portrayals, but it is an important aspect of the broader social impact of violence seen in cartels. While cartel violence is often the focus of crime dramas and action films, these portrayals tend to miss out on showing the deep emotional toll it takes on families. Few films or shows go beyond the surface level action to explore the psychological trauma, guilt, shame, and fear families endure. Law and Order: Boy Gone Astray offers a glimpse into this reality, but there is a need for more nuanced, in-depth storytelling that highlights the human consequences of cartel violence, especially on families. And now for conclusions and questions. The episodes Sunday in the Park with George and Boy Gone Astray from Law and Order demonstrate just how media dramatizations of real-life events can reinforce harmful stereotypes about Latin American communities. By early demonstrating Puerto Ricans and Mexicans in these episodes as criminals, the show continues to portray Latin American countries in a negative light, which as a result normalizes discrimination and justifies systemic bias. How can producers or the creators of these types of shows be held more responsible when adapting real-life events incorrectly? What could the show have done differently to avoid stereotyping? And do you think TV shows or overall the media can change how people see certain groups? Why or why not? And here is our works cited page. Thank you so much.